Welcome everybody to today's privacy platform. Today we have a panel of speakers and a topic which I find particularly exciting, and I think this privacy platform might actually lead to some, let's say, new policies, and that's exciting. Usually we sit there, we discuss and agree or disagree, but it's fairly academic. But this actually might have a policy outcome, given that we're going to discuss something very, very topical, namely targeted surveillance. Is that possible, and what does it mean for European policies? We have until about, I think, we have about an hour and a half, because at 3 o'clock the plenary session starts, and I will have to be in the plenary room and do my democratic duty. But I'm first going to introduce the topic and our speakers. The reason that we chose the topic of targeted surveillance for today is that for some time now we've been having fairly difficult debates about encryption, mass surveillance, and the eternal question of whether there needs to be a balance between security and privacy, which in practice is usually more a trade-off between the two, whereas we would all like to have both security and privacy. And privacy is a term which covers not just, you know, the right to a private life, but also our citizens' rights. And then I stumbled over a news report somewhere about a very interesting company based in Austria, which is working on solutions that actually allow for targeted surveillance, and that might also give an answer to the question about encryption or a ban on encryption. There are lots of people calling for a ban on encryption because they feel they need to be able to investigate people, whereas other people say, but if you do that, then nobody will be safe anymore and nobody can have a real right to privacy anymore. So I got the feeling, having read the news report and having spoken to Jan van Oort, whom I called after having read the report, I thought this might be a very, very interesting avenue, and therefore I'm very pleased to have Jan van Oort on the podium. I'll introduce him a bit more extensively in a minute, but also the responsible commissioner, Mr. Julian King from the European Commission, in charge of security policies and well known to all of you. And I thought to have the two of you here together is an excellent combination. Commissioner King has been appointed only in September last year, but you've already achieved a lot and really built a reputation for yourself. And you know that I always ask critical questions, but I'm very supportive of the approach that you take to security, which is indeed trying to make securities within a legal framework and ensuring citizens' rights. Commissioner King. So then to my left, as I already said, is Jan van Oort, who's a mathematician and big data systems engineer. That sounds a bit scary. And also the chief engineer of Kivu Technologies, the company I just mentioned, a technology company that builds network analysis solutions for counterterrorism. And you are, as a chief engineer, responsible for designing and building the systems architecture at Kivu. And in a minute we'll hear the explanation or the description of the systems that you are developing. Then to his left, Mr. Binney, I think also a name that is well known to all of us here, the former technical director of the United States National Security Agency, who worked on data traffic analysis, code breaking, etc., and who developed ThinThread, a tool that would enable the NSA to pursue targeted surveillance on suspects by identifying specific, potentially significant data, while protecting citizens' privacy and maintaining a small budget, which is of course not unimportant, particularly to Dutch people like myself. We are known for being tight. It's always better to make jokes about yourself before somebody else does it. However, despite the very obvious advantages, the NSA decided not to use the tool that was developed by Mr. Binney. and you retired from the NSA after 9/11 because you were disappointed with the NSA's failures to prevent that, or to at least foresee it. And to the public, you are also known as one of the NSA whistleblowers from the movie A Good American. And finally, to my right, Mr. Federico Fabbrini, who's a professor of European law at the School of Law and Government of Dublin City University. And he's also the author of a book titled Fundamental Rights in Europe. And you've also co-edited a book this year with the title Surveillance, Privacy and Transatlantic Relations, not entirely unimportant. And also the coordinator of the research group on constitutional responses to terrorism within the International Association of Constitutional Law. So I'm not going to say much more about the topic. The only thing I would just like to add is that this session is being web streamed, and it will also be made available on our website after the session. So I'm going to invite first of all Commissioner King to do his introduction, and then the other panelists, and you've each been asked to speak for about 10 minutes, and after that we'll have questions and debate. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I am grateful to be here. I am conscious that I'm sitting on this panel next to a tireless advocate on these issues and some real experts, technical and legal. So it's very kind of you to let me go first, because that gives me a chance to limit the displays of my ignorance on some aspects of this, and I'm very much here to listen and learn as well. But let me start with a few remarks about the kind of approach that I'm trying to promote to thinking about this area. As you said, I'm acutely aware of the delicate balance that we need to try and strike when we're trying to navigate the boundaries in this field, particularly between security and privacy, and the apparent tension between those two. I say apparent because despite the voices that sometimes try to drown each other out by insisting either that we should value security more than privacy, or that privacy takes precedence over security, as I think I have tried to make clear, personally, I believe that security and privacy are not and should not be mutually exclusive, that they are, in fact, and should be complementary policy objectives. It's not always easy to make that happen, but that is the framework in which I think we should try and work. The threats that we're talking about, that I'm charged to try and pull together the strands of policy on, terrorism, cyber, serious and organized crime, are clearly transnational, multifaceted, cross-sectoral, et cetera, et cetera. And while they're not entirely new, indeed they've been around in some form for decades, what is new, I think, is the means and ease with which these threats, crimes are pursued and perpetrated, the precision of their execution, their anonymity, and the breadth and scope of their impact. And indeed, last week, many of us awoke to, in some ways, the worst possible sort of news, a suicide bomber who'd blown himself up in the entrance to a concert, at the end of the concert, killing 22 people, deliberately choosing to target a venue where he knew there would be young people and teenagers. The perpetrator, who was British, born and raised in the UK, of Libyan heritage, had just returned to the UK before the attack. His precise movements are still being investigated, but the German authorities were very quick to be in touch with their British counterparts to let them know that he'd passed through one of the German airports on his way back, it appears, potentially from Libya. Now, I recognize that in the age of big data and in a post-Snowden world, the notion of surveillance especially mass surveillance for national security purposes, has, to put it mildly, a negative connotation, implying somehow overreach by the state without sufficiently robust institutional framework of checks and balances to guard against potential abuse of power. And again, that's one of the background considerations that I think you have to have in mind when you're trying to pursue policy in this area. The famous Telly 2 judgment of December of the ECJ found that legislation which, for the purpose of fighting crime, provides for the general and indiscriminate retention of all traffic and location data of all subscribers and registered users relating to all means of electronic communication is precluded under EU law. The court specified that any data retention framework has to be targeted and limited to what is strictly necessary as the categories of data to be retained, the means of communication affected, the persons concerned, and the time period. So the question we need to tackle now is how to accommodate privacy and data protection with the legitimate operational needs of our law enforcement authorities to detect, prevent, investigate, and prosecute criminal and terrorist offenders. The Commission is currently analysing the implications of the court ruling, and we've said that we will develop guidance as to how national data retention laws can be constructed in conformity with the ruling. Now, I make no secret of the fact that this is not an easy task, and I don't think there's going to be any easy answer. As we think about this and we start to try and prepare the guidance that we've undertaken to develop, we are looking at member states' national data retention rules. In fact, at least 24 member states, 24 out of 28 member states, currently have a mandatory data retention regime. In some of the member states, the National Court annulled their previous data retention regime after the 2014 court ruling invalidating the Data Retention Directive. But then they adopted new legislation in this area. And when we look at the existing national data retention regimes, we can see some convergence on various points. The types of data typically required to be retained are traffic data, location data, and related data necessary to identify the subscriber or the user. The types of communication typically covered are fixed network telephony, mobile telephony, internet telephony, and internet access. Most of the member states, 22, allow for the storage of data from all subscribers and users by all service providers falling within the scope of that was originally provided for in the lapsed Data Retention Directive. The main differences between the national rules are in the length of the retention period, which varies, and the type of crimes for which data may be accessed. In terms of the wider debate, and I'm conscious that this is a very lively as well as topical debate, there's an argument that I hear quite often that access to data, including communications data, for criminal law enforcement purposes is vital, not only to prevent crimes from happening or to investigate suspects and their accomplices after a crime has taken place, but also to help to eliminate suspects from the scope of investigations, to identify victims, to help vulnerable people, and to locate missing people, often very young people. This argument also runs that there needs to be a sufficient body of data available to enable it to be cross-checked against other existing law enforcement information and databases, and thereby to be able to connect the dots between people, data, location, and other physical evidence that may be pertinent in any given case. For instance, investigating sexual offences and financial crime often requires, it's argued, the ability to look for patterns in data sets over a period of time. A good example is, that is sometimes used, is the use of communication data following the arrest in France of Mehdi Nemouche, who was, as you'll remember, responsible for the attack at the Jewish Museum in Brussels, just down the road, in May 2014. The analysis of communication data was central to enabling the services involved to identify possible accomplices. Nemouche had not been identified as a potential terrorist before the attack, before his arrest. So his communication data, it's argued, would have fallen outside of any highly targeted data retention scheme of potential terrorist suspects. But clearly, privacy is at least equally important. There needs to be access to data for criminal investigations or to prevent crimes, but that does not equate to a limitless or indiscriminate interference with privacy. Access needs to be framed within the bounds, as we know, of legality, necessity, and proportionality. In terms of access to retained data, in 13 of our member states, prior review by a court or independent administrative authority is explicitly provided for. And 14 member states have designated an authority exercising independent supervision on access to retained data. So, as we think about this challenge, preparing guidance on the court's ruling, we need to take into account the existing provisions of national data retention schemes. Today, the rapidly evolving cyber landscape, the fluidity of data flows, makes it increasingly difficult for law enforcement authorities to gain access to the relevant electronic information which they need to prevent, investigate, trace, and prosecute criminal and sometimes terrorist activity. This is for reasons which include the use and misuse by criminals of legitimate services and tools such as anonymization and, as you mentioned, encryption. Flaws in the basic architecture of the internet, notably the way IP addresses work, or because the data are not kept for sufficiently long periods by providers, or the location of the data is unknown or stored in multiple jurisdictions. This is why, in the Commission, we are also currently working on improving criminal justice in cyberspace with a focus on cross-border access to electronic evidence. We will present some findings on this at the next JHA Council in June, and we're reflecting on the role of encryption in criminal investigations and running legal and technical work streams on the issues around that before we present our analysis and proposals later in the autumn. It's clear that our response to the very serious threats we're facing must continue to be based on our core values, and in particular the rule of law, the jurisprudence of the ECJ, and respect for fundamental rights. This is the spirit in which the EU is built, respecting rights whilst ensuring effective protection to individuals. As I said earlier, security and privacy are not mutually exclusive. So I very much welcome the opportunity today to try and thresh out some of these issues. I look forward to hearing from the others on the panel. Protecting privacy at a time when security is increasingly at the forefront of our political agenda is, for me, absolutely key if we're going to avoid unwittingly doing the terrorist work for them, or indeed the cyber criminals, because they are seeking to undermine our way of life, undermine our freedoms and our values. So checks and balances are, for me, a central part of safeguarding those freedoms and values. I welcome the opportunity to raise these issues with you today. I don't think this will be the last time we'll be discussing these issues over the coming weeks and months, but I do hope that we're going to be able to work through them together. Thank you.
Thank you very much for kicking off the debate. I think one of the things that you mentioned, and which is actually central to today's topic, is any powers that we create for public authorities have to be necessary and proportionate In other words, not go beyond what is really needed. And that's the big question, because the security services and the law enforcement services often argue that they need mass surveillance because otherwise they can't do their jobs. Now, even if you assume that's true, if we were then to find means which are less intrusive than mass surveillance, then clearly we should use those means and not resort to mass surveillance anymore, because that would then become, by definition, illegal. Because if less intrusive but equally effective means are available, that means that anything that goes beyond that is outside the law, basically. So that's the reason that I wanted to have this panel here today, because I'm first going to invite Jan van Oort to explain to us the systems that they are designing in Kivu, which actually seem to be the solution to this dilemma. Then I'm going to invite Binney to share his rich experience and views with us on this precise issue, and then I'm going to ask Mr. Fabbrini to conclude. So I'm going to invite you to each speak for about 10 minutes, because we'll have plenty of time for questions and debate afterwards. Mr. van Oort, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Your Excellency, Commissioner King, dear Mrs. in Veld, dear members of Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to speak here today, especially for us as such a small startup. And I would like my opening phrase to be, it is feasible. Besides being desirable, affordable and testable, it can be done. Commissioner King, your concerns can be addressed. Targeted security analysis is an engineerable option. The respect of privacy and identity of European citizens presumed innocent can be upheld within the context of an ongoing security-related investigation. I'm here to discuss with you the how, now that we are going to hear, I hope, thoughtful and insightful remarks about the why and the what. You are about to see the high-level architecture of something we call privacy by design. That is our approach at solving this admittedly thorny problem. Don't worry, we're not going to do advanced math or computer science. This is just a walkthrough of the feasibility and engineering aspects of this topic. Back in Vienna, at Kivu, we invent, design, and then build technology to help save lives. That's what we do. We believe that this is possible through software, and this belief drove us 1 year ago to setting up Kivu. We invented a new algebraic way of dealing with networks. And with this invention, of which you are seeing a screenshot right now, it's already existing and running software, we designed and are now building an intelligence analysis system to target and collect data on terrorist threats, not on citizens, on terrorist threats. We do not want counterterrorism analysts to drown in data, but we want such analysts to have actionable data, what we call actionable intelligence, that makes a difference to help save lives. Naively, how do you look for a needle in a haystack? Well, perhaps you will take the entire haystack apart and sift through the parts. That's how you do it, right? Well, we believe you do it differently. You rather reduce the haystack's size, allowing the needle to light up all by itself. Now, there has been an assumption that if you have more data, you have more intelligence. There's absolutely no guarantee of this. Another approach focuses on, the word has already been pronounced, targeted analysis. This saves analysts mission-critical time. It removes the need for expensive hardware, much of it, and requires less manpower and man-hours. Well, targeted collection of information and the automation of data sorting at the outset are two ways we use in the software of which you see the graphical user interface on the screen. The technology behind our platform is extremely fast. In itself, this is not a goal or a nice feature, but it allows for additional capabilities that you put on top of them, such as, for example, granular encryption, data obfuscation, internal and external controls, checks and balances, to not have detrimental speed issues. I am not at all sure of the exact technical knowledge of the audience, so I will say in the simplest manner, we combine massive network analysis with, in the very near future, machine learning and artificial intelligence to enable counter-terrorism agencies to identify radicalized or radicalizing individuals before they become terrorists. As an engineer, I can tell you that encryption of what we call the uniquely identifiable aspects of a piece of data can be built into any analysis process. So-called privacy by design is technically feasible, and it is something we are capable of building on top of the tool you are seeing here. Analysts can then work on data without knowing exactly what or whose data it is. So they can work with metadata behavior. You will have heard the word metadata, with metadata behavior and metadata patterns. As you see from my slide, we define privacy to be the automated governance and oversight process protecting the privacy or the identity or both of those presumed innocent by an innovative use of public key cryptography. I'm not going to explain this and do a course in computer science about what public key cryptography is. We can talk about it after the event if you need more information. But in essence, what a system does, it automatically, and this is important to emphasize, it automatically encrypts the uniquely identifiable aspect, for example, address, phone number. We call it UIA in order not to be obliged to have this mouthful all the time. We call it UIA, uniquely identifiable aspects of the data. And those aspects are split up so that a government official would be unable to decrypt this data without agreement from a magistrate and without oversight by an exclusive oversight public body, ideally an elected public body. Therefore, the identity of presumed innocents can remain secret until a magistrate orders such information to be disclosed. For example, in the context of a court-ordered investigation. Now, such a system, that's maybe not immediately clear from the image, but such a system gives and delivers 5 strong guarantees. The first one is one I just implicitly mentioned. UIAs, uniquely identifiable aspects of incoming data, are automatically encrypted before a human eye can observe these. The fragments of the private key later needed to decrypt such UIAs are immediately distributed to magistrates and public oversight bodies. Those are the green edges, the green lines on the slide. Second, the automatic encryption process leaves a verifiable and publicly available audit trail. Third guarantee, whoever is not in the possession at any moment of all the required private key fragments for a particular UIA of some particular record, for example, the record on Mrs. Müller, will be unable to see the UIA of Mrs. Müller's record, regardless, and this is important to emphasize, regardless of the whoever being a human or a non-human agent. Fourth guarantee, and that's maybe the most important part, whoever has the necessary key fragments, magistrate has said there's probable cause for an investigation, I'm going to give my key fragment to the security agency, public oversight body, for example, the European government, parliament or a national parliament, says you can have our piece as well, it was deposited here, and then decrypts a record UIA also and always leaves an audit trail. And that enables both the concerned individual's identity to be protected against investigation without probable cause, and, very important, it also allows the agent's organization, that means, let's say, the police force or the public prosecutor or the security agency, to prove a posteriori or during the process that they acted or are still acting within legal limits. 5, something that's more interesting to mathematicians and engineers, maybe not so much to you, but there's a 5th guarantee. This kind of encryption, public-private key encryption, is performed by its nature upon data structures that are very well representable as mathematical objects. And that allows for the delivery of strong correctness proofs, mathematically strong correctness proofs, on the algorithms used in this process. That means you can actually provide very hard proof this algorithm is correct, doesn't have side effects and unintended effects, etc. Well, we think and we hope that a business case can be made for this invention. As a company, as a private company, we of course need a business case. As such, my colleague Daniela Klimpfinger, she's here today as well, and I myself and all of us at Kivu, we share an opinion similar to that of Mr. Binney. Yes, it is technically feasible for targeted analysis to be combined with privacy safeguards to serve the interests of national security. Yes, we can. We are capable of building such a solution. Thank you very much for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Binney.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank you for inviting me here to talk. I'd like to share my experience of what we were doing at NSA before I left there. I left primarily because they started spying on U.S. citizens, which was a violation of our Constitution. And when they did that in secret. I wasn't supposed to know about it, but of course I found out about it. But the point was we faced the problem in the 1990s, the mid-90s on, of the massive explosion in the digital communications age. And so even back then, 20 years ago, our analysts were buried in so much data that they couldn't actually succeed at doing their job. They couldn't get through their data that came into them every day. So the next day would come in, they wouldn't have finished the previous day, so they could never keep up. So they were there struggling, trying to find something that was meaningful for them and make it to actually produce intelligence. A lot of people in the United States are calling data intelligence. You know, a collection of data is just more intelligence. It's not intelligence until you understand what you've collected and made meaning of it. And that's the problem. That's where we fail. And that's why no one can stop any of these terrorist attacks, because there's too much data. Now it's orders of magnitude greater. So the main problem we faced back then, as the technical director, that was my problem to try to solve. How can we reduce that massive amount of data down to a reasonably manageable set of information that's relevant and finite enough for our analysts to be able to manage and succeed at doing their jobs? That brought it down to saying, well, if you look at the data passing by, the content of it, if you start doing that, you are doomed, because you can never get through it. So the point is, we then said, okay, we should use metadata as the way of pulling together communities of people cooperating in activities around the world. That is the phone networks or the internet connections or financial transactions or travel or anything like that. You could build graphs of relationships of people doing things together. That then divided the entire world into subsets of communities of people involved in some activity. So from there, from that, you can then pull together, from known knowledge that we had at the time and developed over time, you could pull together the terrorist network. And we, in fact, did that. We had the entire terrorist network for Al-Qaeda worldwide before 9/11. In fact, we had actually Osama bin Laden's phone number, Inmarsat phone number. We were monitoring that from 96 to 98, and then after we started attacking him, he shut it off. So, but the point was, we then could boil it down to a finite number using metadata. We could then pull together the communities of people that were related in an activity, and some of that was terror or dope smuggling or pedophilia or any kind of criminal activity, we could define that by those communities and then focus on the metadata that would allow us to pull that information out from the flowing information on the fiber optic networks. So that was the key. Once we did that, then that would pull any relevant data, which would create that rich environment for our analysts to look at, to analyze, and start to succeed at their jobs. So we instigated that in a program we called Thin Thread. But actually, since I was working the metadata, I pulled in all the other databases that NSA had on metadata too. So Thin Thread was one real-time input, but the rest of it was archived, and we pulled all of that together. So we were dealing with the tens of trillions of transactions and managing them without any difficulty at all. And also being able to select it out on fiber optic rates. So we were doing this in 1998 and 1999. And we managed that, and it really reduced the volume problem and made it possible to do all kinds of things with that. The problem was we faced a budget issue. We only spent $3,200,000 to develop the whole system and have it deployed to 3 separate sites running 24 hours a day for a year and a half to show the concept really worked. And we were managing each of those sites with a 64 kilobit telephone line. That's all the data we got back from all those sites. That was multiple fiber lines at each site. And we were able to keep up with that process, and the point was we were filtering out all data that wasn't relevant to anything at all. And we used the logic principles of deductive, inductive, and abductive logic to do it. The deductive logic was simply said, if you have a data set, a graph of relationships in that data set using the metadata, then you pull in everything within 2 degrees of known terrace. That then defines the zone of suspicion. That creates a rich environment because if they're in proximity, there's a high potential for them to be related. Certainly if they're talking directly to them, you could easily get a warrant for that because we'd have a known terrorist talking directly to somebody that was easy to get a warrant. But we could also justify it by saying, by the proximity. And if we could get agreement with the courts, which is what we were trying to do at the time, then we'd automate that process for requesting warrants to the court. And then we, of course, offered the ability for the court to issue the warrant, and we would do the code to do that for them also, so that they could manage several million requests a day, if necessary. But the point was, you would have a fixed set of criteria that would be agreed to by the courts, by the analysts, and would satisfy both and make it possible to actually succeed at collecting data that would make it a meaningful result come out from their analysts, which is how they're the ones who are supposed to declare warning on intentions and capabilities of terrorists or anybody else. And if they can't do that, then you're going to fail. That's what's been happening here in Europe. That's what's been happening in the United States. They've been failing consistently. They're good at entrapping people, but at stopping the real terrorists, they're doing a miserable job. So the other approach we used was the what he called inductive approach, that said, well, if somebody was communicating or talking or looking on the web to sites that advocate pedophilia, for example, or sites that were advocating jihad or terrorism or violence against the West, we would say they might be in the process of radicalization. And so we would say that's an argument, if they visit the site maybe once or twice, that's an argument saying that we need to look at them, at least to resolve the issue of whether or not they are or not intending to do something. So that, that we would say falls into the zone of suspicion. Now the abductive approach is kind of the, you know absolutely nothing, and you want to find a terrorist group. Well, you know the countries in the world that do are involved in terrorism and export terrorism. So you look for communities that show geographic distribution of a certain percentage of the community. You can say 80 or a greater percentage of that distribution of those individual elements. The nodes, you can tell from the metadata where they are located in which country in the world. So it's not a question of not being able to do that. You can easily do that. In fact, it's been commercially available to do that since 2002 by NARIS and Variant devices. They automatically can do this. We were doing it in the 1990s and in 98, 99. But that then would give you an idea that here's a community that is distributed in along the lines of countries that are exporting terrorism. So that gives you the idea that you need to look at that community to resolve one way or the other, is it or is it not involved? So those are the ways by behavior more than anything else. People and their behavior in the electronic world of communications, those behavioral properties were the things that we keyed on to say we need to collect their data, to look at it, to resolve them one way or the other, or to monitor them constantly. So, and that we were quite successful at doing in that time frame at fiber optic rates, and we saw no limit to being able to do that. The only problem was we ran into opposing the existing structure that wanted to build a big program, multi-billion-dollar program, and companies were supporting that, and they lobbied against us in Congress to stop us, because this is companies lobbying Congress to stop an internal government-run program because it was threatening their ability to feed on billions of dollars. And so they perpetuated the lie that you had to give up privacy for security. Why? Because it takes tens of billions of dollars to collect all that data, plus tens of billions of dollars to store it. I mean, the one storage facility they finished in Utah cost over $2.2 billion. Now they're building one that's 2.8 million square foot, almost 3 times the size of that, on Fort Meade in Maryland. They broke ground for that last summer. That one's probably going to run $5 to $6 billion. That doesn't count all the other supercomputer buildings and other kinds of storage facilities all around the United States they had to build to store all this data. They're not throwing away any of this data. They're keeping it all and retroactively analyzing it back to 2001. It's not going away. It's all there. It's all there for them to look at. And other countries that are participating with them, mainly the Five Eyes countries, and about 8 others, most of them here in Europe, are participating with them. And they have access to at least portions of that data. It has to do with the agreements they have to arrange between them as to how much of that data they can share with one another. They use the program X-Keyscore to go in and interrogate that program. But the point is, you can have privacy and security at the same time by a targeted, focused approach, because it creates a rich environment for your analysts to succeed, which means they create warning, which means you can save lives. And at the same time, you're filtering out everybody else's data and you don't take it in. No country has it to use or abuse, so you're giving them privacy. This was easily done back using the program ThinThread. Unfortunately, the program was capable of dealing with massive amounts of data, so what they did was they modified it and used it to do the massive collection they're doing today. What they did was, instead of using the filtering up front, they simply took that filtering away and took in everything. Then we had another program that encrypted all the attributes of people. If they weren't known terrorists, we would encrypt their data attributes so you couldn't tell who they were, and they removed that so that not only would they take in everything, but they would be able to see the identity of everybody through the metadata. And the third thing was we had a monitoring program that monitored our entire network, that would see anybody coming into the network, where they went, what they did, what data they looked at, what they did with the data, how they manipulated it, and actually we were going to use it to help train people. If we could see they needed some training in certain skill field areas, we could devise that. We could also monitor things like Edward Snowden couldn't have done what he did if we had that program in place, because once he started draining the data across the network, we would know that. So the problem was they wanted to get rid of that too, and their reason was a little different, because it would also show all kinds of things like how they moved money around internally in NSA from one program to another, or how they were authorized money from Congress to do a certain thing and they'd use it for something else. We would also know that. And we'd also know the return on investment on all programs and be able to calculate that, and also say these programs are failing, those are succeeding, and be able to do that. And also Congress could look at that, and then they could make adjustments to the budget accordingly. And of course, that's what NSA didn't want to be known. They simply wanted the money, and they wanted to be left alone, and they didn't want anybody to know what they're really doing. And that's basically how they've been operating all along. That's why I've called oversight in the United States or in any other country in the world a joke. But my point is that we had a program running that gave privacy and security, and you could do it again, and I'm helping to consult with these guys to make that possible.
Excellent, thank you very much. And then we'll immediately go to our last speaker on the panel, Mr. Fabbrini. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Sophie, and thank you to the ALDE group for inviting me at the European Parliament. It's nice to be back in the House of the European Citizens. I'm grateful for this opportunity. In a way, it's fitting that the lawyers comes last in this panel, because the reality of things is that the law is always trying to catch up on technology. We are always lagging behind and trying to sort of close the gap as we move forward. But the reality is that, of course, law is very important in offering a constitutional framework within which privacy and surveillance have to be balanced in the logics of checks and balances that Commissioner King previously mentioned. So being a law professor myself, I just want to give you a brief introduction to the legal framework, which I think has to be taken into account when we are having these discussions about surveillance, particularly in the context of the European Union. So I will structure my presentation in a few quick points. First of all, I will just clarify what are the basic constitutional principles that have to be taken into account. Secondly, I will quickly discuss the case law of the European Court of Justice, which I think is giving us a lot of guidance on how we need to move forwards. Thirdly, I will identify some big legal challenges that I think we will have to face in the next few months, and I will then quickly conclude. So on the constitutional principles, basically, as most of you know, the European Union is endowed of what is perhaps the most protective legal framework in the world for privacy and data protection. The Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, which was adopted in 2000 and it's binding since 2009, has two specific provisions on privacy and data protection, Article 7 and Article 8. It is interesting in comparative perspective that hardly any other constitutional document or international human rights document is so specific in identifying an objective of human rights protection. And it is interesting also to stress that the question of data protection is not only relevant as a fundamental right protected in the Charter, which has constitutional status, but is also entrenched in the EU treaties, and particularly Article 16 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union sets as an objective for the EU itself to maintain a high degree of data protection. So those are the sort of basic constitutional principles which frame the discussion, and the European Court of Justice has built on it over the last few years by developing what I would call the most progressive privacy case law in the world. This case law is very vast. It covers multiple areas. Of course, I cannot touch upon all the details here, but limiting myself to the question specifically of surveillance, there are two major judgments delivered by the European Court of Justice, which heavily shape the balance between privacy and surveillance. And these judgments have, in a way, already been mentioned by Commissioner King in his introductory remarks. It's Digital Rights Ireland, delivered in 2014, and Tele2's Verige of December last year. I've just reported here the data on the European Court's reporter, just in case some of you want to go and look up at these two judgments. Now, they are very important. Why? In the first judgment in Digital Rights Ireland, the European Court of Justice declared null and void the European Data Retention Directive. So it annulled an entire piece of EU legislation which compelled member states to require IT companies to retain data, or better, metadata emerging from electronic communication. And the rationale of the court was that the measure was not proportionate, so it was not compatible with the principle of proportionality that, Sophie, you mentioned at the beginning of this panel. Now, there was a lot of discussion whether the Digital Rights Ireland case of the European Court of Justice impacted upon national legislation on data retention. I had argued that it did, but in December last year, the court, in fact, confirmed it in the Tele2's Verige case, where it ruled that national legislation compelling the retention of data must be compatible with the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, and in this specific case, the United Kingdom and Sweden were found not to be compatible. But perhaps even more importantly, the December 2016 judgment of the ECJ set the rule that there has to be judicial authorization in every measure regarding surveillance. So surveillance cannot be mass or dragnet. It has to be targeted. That's the sort of, you said in your presentation that it's possible. From a legal perspective, it's necessary. So targeted surveillance is a necessity to the extent that dragnet surveillance, it's illegal. But perhaps also very important to stress is the fact that you need to have judicial involvement in the entire process so that the intelligence agencies or the police forces, any sort of authority involved in the prevention of crime must go through an independent check before undertaking surveillance. So I think that's where we stand, and of course there are challenges in how we move forward, and I was pleased to see that the Commission is trying to come up with guidelines, although it's, I think, the space for data retention measures at the national level after this last judgment of the court is very limited. Precisely because it has to be targeted and it has to be judicially approved. So what should we expect moving ahead? Well, I think there are at least a couple of big questions that will need to be answered from a legal point of view. One has to do with transatlantic relations, more specifically going back to the point of the previous presentation. As many of you will know, again, the European Court of Justice in the Schrems judgment last year, in 2015, so 2 years ago, declared the EU-US Safe Harbor Agreement not compatible with the Charter. This has been replaced by a new EU-US Privacy Shield. As you know, cases are pending challenging the Privacy Shield for compliance with the Charter of Fundamental Rights in light of the latest case law of the court. And in fact, the main problem of the EU-US Privacy Shield is that, at least from a EU perspective, what is going on in the United States is not compatible with the principles set in the Charter. So surveillance is not necessarily targeted and certainly is not always judicially approved. So you would have there a lacuna, or at least an inconsistency between the EU legal framework and the American framework, which raises questions about the adequacy of the EU Privacy Shield in terms of compliance with the Charter. And then, of course, I also wanted to mention as one of the challenges ahead, not least because we have the British Commissioner speaking in this panel. I think
British nominated.
British nominated Commissioner. Of course, the Commission is representing the European interest, but we know there's one Commissioner per member state. And I think a big issue facing us as we move forward will be what is the status of the United Kingdom after Brexit in terms of data protection. So the Teletus Verija case was delivered also as a response to a preliminary reference procedure coming from the United Kingdom, and it ruled that UK legislation was not compatible with the Charter, and for as long as the United Kingdom is a member state of the European Union, of course, the European Court of Justice has the final say on this, but once the UK is out, it will be free to adopt its own legislation outside the legal constraints set by the Charter, but that poses a whole set of legal questions in terms of cooperation. If the UK is not complying with the Charter, how can EU intelligence agencies or EU police forces exchange data with the United Kingdom in respect of the Charter? And I think it was interesting to see that in the guidelines adopted by the Council for the Brexit negotiation, there is a specific reference on data protection precisely to address this issue. There's a whole other set of questions that are, I think, emerging from this debate. Of course, I cannot address them now, but I hope in the Q&A session we can deal with this. But as every good academic, let me conclude by, of course, advertising my book, which you mentioned, Sophie, on surveillance, privacy, and transatlantic relations, which deals with this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Well, that's an applause for all the panelists. I was actually going to say something about commercial interest, so you just made it very easy for me. So thank you all very much. And before opening the floor for questions and debate, just one brief thought. When we're talking about what is necessary and proportionate, the arguments for the necessity of mass surveillance very often come from the, let's say, the security and law enforcement community, more often even from politicians such as myself, who really truly believe that mass surveillance is the only way. So there may be a genuine, a sincere desire to use mass surveillance for security. There may also be a degree, certainly amongst politicians again, and I'm also looking at myself, of mere ignorance. You know, we just don't know. We're not tech whiz kids. We just don't know. We're not security agents either. So if experts tell us that, oh, mass security is really, you know, is indispensable, we absolutely need it, who are we to say that's not true? So there is a degree of ignorance. But of course, it would be very naive to disregard completely the other interests that may be driving this mass collection of data, namely the interests of the authorities involved to not be transparent, because both of you actually explained how the systems that you are promoting not only allow for security and privacy protection, but also increased transparency and scrutiny. Which is something that we've been pushing for. And of course, I mean, you know, me working in a public institution, the natural inclination of public authorities is to be as intransparent as possible, because we really don't want, you know, citizens nosing around in our business, because that's very inconvenient. So, and the final one is, of course, that there are commercial interests. Now, I'm a market liberal. I've got nothing against businesses who want to make a buck. I've made the point here more often. But there, too, there has to be transparency. And then I'm not actually not sure if you're aware of this, but I am involved in a tiny little battle with the European Commission over getting access to documents that might demonstrate the commercial interests in the PNR directive. And there is one particular document referring to a particular business contract that depended on the adoption of the PNR directive, and it is precisely that document that the Commission refuses to disclose. And I'm pretty sure that I'm going to get my way. It may take a few years, but so you might as well give it to us now. But no, but that I think that underlines, of course, there are huge financial interests, I would say, in setting up these systems. Now, again, I've got nothing against commercial interest, but this is about public money, it's about fundamental rights, it's about the rule of law, it is about democracy, so these things have to be transparent. We have to know what the commercial interests are driving these programs. Citizens also have a right to know, and politicians as well. Because if I'm, as a politician, if I'm not aware of these interests, then, you know, I will only hear the case made by the security community, telling me that this is all indispensable, absolutely necessary, urgent, and, you know, I've already been accused of tying the hands of people fighting terrorism and having blood on my hands. So I need, in order to take the right decisions, and you too, to come up with the solutions which strike this right balance, we have to have all the information. So this too, I think, is vital. Okay, having made all those remarks, I'm going to open the floor for questions and debate, and I think most of you are aware of the rules. You state your name, you try to be really brief, stick to 1 minute, and preferably also indicate to which of the panelists you address your question or remark. So, who would like to kick off? Okay, I see one request in the middle. Please use the microphone.
Okay, great, thank you. My name is Erik Valgaard and I'm a partner with Stibbe in a TMT practice. I have a question for Mr. Van Oort. If I hear you set out the Kivu platform, it is my feeling, best guess, that it is in line or as good in line with the Tele2 case requirements as to what surveillance going forward could still mean for security or law enforcement agencies. Is that something that has been confirmed? I mean, have you obtained confirmation from other sources that your platform would allow for surveillance in line with the Tele2 criticisms or the openings left? And then the second question following from that is, if that is true, I mean, if you have a business case that would allow for surveillance in accordance with the Tele2 criteria, how would we manage that? I mean, a starting company such as yourself having kind of struck gold with this platform, and then you will have all the governments coming to you to use that system or platform. How will we manage such a raid on your platform? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. To address the first point, we are now almost exactly a year old. We've been writing code, we've been building, we've been testing, and we are ready to go to market with a commercially viable solutions in a couple of weeks. So the answer to your first question is, by the nature of what a startup, and in Dutch there is a saying, as poor as a church rat, a very poor startup is, no, we do not have customer validation yet. We are going to market in a couple of weeks. Second, the way an implementation of privacy by design could be done, ideally, I'm talking about privacy by design now, what I showed here, which is something built with the help of and on top of our platform we're going to market with, what I presented here. Ideally, what an implementation would look like, one, there would be a so-called, it's a much hyped word, so I'm careful with this, but there would be a so-called public-private partnership. We would, in order to build, we know we can build it, in order to actually build it, we would need guidance and framing, in the positive sense of the word, by various EU institutions, of course, and we would need a security agency or a national police force or a public prosecutor willing to serve as a host for, let's say, a demonstrator or a proof of concept. This having been said, apart from the fact that we are a private company, and as Sophie said, we simply need to make a buck, right? We need to earn our lives at the end of the day. This having been said, such an implementation, I'm an engineer, don't like to use this word, but our gut feeling is it could be done with relatively modest to very modest resources in a relatively short time span. Is this an answer to your question?
Yes, I'm still trying to figure out whether the platform as you described it and the technology as you described it would actually be at least the beginning of an answer to the concerns addressed by the European Court of Justice in the Tele2 case.
Yes, we've specifically built it in order to be that. Yes.
I would actually
I guess that would be the right order. They didn't rule that decision so that you would be able to market your solution.
Well, the
right?
thing that happened is that I don't know if you've seen the documentary A Good American featuring Mr. Binney and his colleague Kirk Wiebe. We had a private showing of the documentary last, when was it, November, at our company, and we had never heard about Bill Binney, Kirk Wiebe, about Thin Thread at all. And we've all seen that documentary at our company. And when the last credits had been shown and there was silence in the room, we were going through a whole series of emotions from joy to astonishment, because without having had the requirements, without knowing Mr. Binney or the whole history, we realized we had actually built Thin Thread 2.0. So I think that this answers your question, yes.
But I think the practical suggestion that I would make, because I know that there is a lot of expertise in a very wide range of disciplines present in this room. So your question is essentially, is your system Tele2 compliant? Basically, is this the so, you know, I would invite everybody here who has all the necessary technological, political and legal knowledge to come to you after the session and maybe offer their services, because I think this would be in the general interest. What's the pay? Well, you know, sometimes you have to do something in the public interest. Yes. Maybe you'll end up in a history book. That would be good.
Well, yeah, I was told explicitly not to do a sales talk, so I didn't do a sales talk. But of course, as Sophie said, we have to make a buck. So yeah, I'm open to any sort of discussions after the Q&A.
Okay, very good. More questions. Hilke.
Yeah, does it work? Yeah. I'm a consultant in this area and specialized in privacy, data protection, security, etc. I have, indeed, my question goes also relates to Tele2, because what I still don't know of the whole discussion is that I understand very well that we can target, for instance, the access to information, access to data. The access to data, we can also have good checks and balances, ensuring that when authorities have access to personal data, that there's transparency about it, that there's oversight, etc. But about storage of data, is there, because there the argument has always been, we need all this information, we need the historical information about people communicating on the internet or about communicating through telecommunications. Is in the argument of Mr. Van Oort, or maybe also in the argument of Commissioner King, is there still the need to store all the information by telecommunications companies, by internet companies, of all the communications of the past? Or is, in your opinion, we can find solutions where there's no need to store information of all previous historical communications?
Thank you. I think this question could be answered by basically everybody on the podium. Who would like to respond first? Mr. Binney.
I think the short answer to that is no. If you do a targeted approach and do it right, you can do target development, also using the same deductive, inductive, and abductive approaches. There is no case of any terrorist that's occurred, any terrorist attack that's occurred that couldn't have been picked out by those approaches. None, even before 9/11. Even the 9/11 ones could have been picked out, which they were on the NSA database. They ran the thin thread program on the NSA database after in February of 2002, about a few months after 9/11, and they found all the data they had in their database that they didn't even know they had because their analysts couldn't get to it, that would have given them warning on a 9/11 event happening. The terrorists in our country, they could have notified the FBI to follow them. They could have reconstructed their entire network inside the country from the data they already had. So I'd say the answer to that is no. They don't need to store the data if targeted approach is done properly.
Yeah, in order maybe to say a few more words, you just mentioned data coming from ISPs, telco companies, right? You need to make a clear distinction, and that maybe has not become clear from the brevity of our presentations, between data as content and metadata. Let's imagine that the bald gentleman over there is a known bad guy, right? He's suspected of being a terrorist. And I'm going to analyze the network around him. There are two ways to do this. I can do it, let's say, the NSA way. It means I'm going to simply ingest all of his communications and seek through the contents of his communications. That is going to make me run, sooner or later, into the problem as described by Mr. Binney. I'm going to have a couple of million of square foot of computing power if I do this at a national level. However, if I don't do that, I want to avoid that, then the only thing I analyze around this gentleman is the fact that he frequently communicates with the blonde lady over there. The basic fact. That is several orders of magnitude less information than the actual content. Only if I realize that this makes an interesting person out of the blonde lady over there because she's so close to a known bad guy, I'm going to ask a judge for probable cause to investigate into the blonde lady, maybe to lift the encryption of her privacy. Only from that moment on, I'm going to look into actual content of communications. If I do it, as Mr. Binney says, if I do it really well, I don't have to store anything.
You still would need to store, I think, the metadata.
You even do not store the metadata. You store you store the inferences and the conclusions you draw from the metadata. That's yet an order of magnitude less of information. You do store something, of course, but way less than in the NSA approach.
I think the question is, and then I'm going to ask Commissioner King to come in as well, but is the thing is, do you store the data of all people? Because by the time you realize that the gentleman in the audience is a bad guy, you want to be able to retrace his contacts, basically. And that's what we are always being told. We need to have this historical data because somebody may actually not even be a bad guy, but turn into a bad guy, and then we need to. I always think this is a very dangerous argument because there are lots of bad guys doing lots of bad things, and you know, and anybody can 20 years from now turn into a criminal. Maybe one day I'll be one. So the whole rationale behind storing all that information, because I realize it's frustrating for law enforcement and security services that it means that some cases cannot be resolved. But this is, of course, a kind of question which I think is also an ethical question at some point. It's not a technical, legal question, it's also an ethical question. But I'm going to ask Commissioner King first to respond to this one, the difficult one.
Well, that's what we're struggling with, frankly, which is why I'm very happy to be here and part of this conversation, which I don't think we're necessarily going to be able to conclude definitively today. We are in the middle of a discussion around these issues, which is framed by the legal framework, which has been very clearly set out, thank you very much, and the existing practices. And at the moment, those are not entirely overlapping, and we need to find some way of moving them closer together. And part of that process, which I don't think we're going to be able to resolve today, but it's very good that we're getting into it, will be about technology, I guess. But part of it will be about how we think about these concepts of collection, storage, what is data, what data are we talking about, and access. Because I think we are more developed, I speak under instruction here of our legal friends, but I think we are a little bit more developed to date in how we think about the proper constraints around access. And that has to be part of working out how we're going to take this forward.
Yeah, if I can just follow up on this with a small technical note here. I think your question about storage also has to do a lot with who is storing this data. And I think there is an interesting divide between the United States and the European Union, in the sense that in the United States, it has been mostly the government who has been storing the data, and there has been significant public concerns about that. Not least because, of course, citizens have constitutional rights vis-a-vis the government. In the context of the European Union, storing of data has mostly been done by private corporations. And the reality is that private corporations do it for money. So they store data all the time because they're able to resell it, or simply because it's a part of their operating business. And that has led, I think, in the context of the European Union, to a number of steps in the direction of protecting the data subject in the way in which his data are stored. And I'm thinking here, for instance, of the Google Spain judgment of the European Court of Justice, another important case, which is ultimately about the famous right to be forgotten, but that is something that emerges precisely because Google is storing data anyway. So if Google is storing data, then you as the data subject have a right at least to ask Google to cancel those data when things evolve, or if they don't comply with particular public interest. So I think the questions of the private versus public dimension of storage is also relevant in this discussion. And as a non-tech savvy, I always ask myself, why is it that in the European Union it's not governments themselves that collect all this data? And my understanding is that the capabilities to do so is actually less than in the United States, which is why, I mean, the data retention directly basically outsourced to the private sector the retention of data that was then used for national security purposes.
Thanks. But I think the key question is also if we can minimize with new technological solutions or even existing ones, if we can minimize the collection and storage of data and access to the data. And if we can preserve privacy protection instruments like encryption without actually tying the hands of the security agencies. Is that, because that would be my question to you, is the Commission, are you, and I suspect that you are, would you then embrace that and say, look, this is a better way forward, we can still achieve the same security goals without actually intruding as much on people's private lives as we did before, because they're new solutions?
Well, what I certainly can subscribe to as an objective, quite how we're going to achieve it, I don't know yet, is that we're not, as you said right at the very beginning, we're not going to be supporting systems that are intrusive for intrusiveness' sake. No interest in doing that. So if you can be less intrusive and equally effective, to quote you exactly, then of course we should be ready to look at that.
Okay, but that would be one step beyond looking into it, means to actually also take that for an objective. It's a legal requirement, but I think one which is in the political practice of the day-to-day practices is often forgotten. Further questions?
Arjen Kamphuis, Lead Advisor, Brunel, Information Security. I've been looking at this for 20 years, and I've never seen any evidence anywhere that mass surveillance is effective, and most of the people I know who used to work in the various intelligence services in the US and UK and other countries seem to agree with that, especially if they're former, because then they speak more freely. So would it be reasonable for us as citizens to ask maybe the Commission or maybe the Parliament to provide some sort of evidence that the measures they propose after every incident would have actually prevented that incident? So we've now had a series of terrorist incidents in Europe over the last 15 years. Most of them have been so-called lone wolves. In none of these incidents, encryption of communications played a significant factor. Yet after every incident, we will hear somebody from the security services or somebody from the government within hours after the incident, when the blood is not even dry, saying that A, we now need to intercept all communications because of this lone wolf attack, and B, we now need to backdoor encryption even though no encryption was used in this attack. So could we have some sort of evidence policy where the proposed measure can actually be reasonably, logically said to have prevented the thing after which it is suggested? And if that's not the case, because we asked this from pharmaceutical companies, for instance, prove this stuff works before you're allowed to sell it to European citizens. So maybe we should have that standard. Indeed. For this.
Goes for car safety and other things as well. Okay, I'm going to collect a few more questions and then ask the panelists to respond and also make their closing remarks so that we can wind up in 12 minutes from now. I'm going to take 2 or 3 more questions. I see one over here, one over there, one in the back. Okay, that's it.
Yeah, it's a question for Commissioner King. If at the GHA next week, 8 and 9 of June, also the issue of encryption will be touched upon or not. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Over there.
Yes.
Can you all state your name and the organization you work for?
Sara Monteleone from EPRS. Just probably a recurring question in this kind of conference of discussion. What do you think could be a definition of metadata? We probably have different idea of it, but I think especially from our technical expert, would be good to have a definition, especially in taking into account that according to the European legal system, metadata are considered to be personal data, and they should be covered by the legal framework. Thank you.
Okay, last question, lady in the back.
Thank you. I'm Estelle Massé from Access Now, which is an NGO that works to protect privacy in the digital era. I have a short question for Commissioner King on the current implementation of the PNR directive, which was very urgent for the member states to know how this is going, and in particular the Belgium implementation, which extends to other member states. We had received letters from the Commission saying that they would monitor this very closely to make sure it respects all fundamental rights and also the freedom of movement in the EU. So it would be great to hear from you.
I'm going to be very, very blunt here, but that question is really outside this, although it's one which interests me a lot because I've been working on PNR for about 500 years, but it's one which is outside the scope of this session. So, but I'm sure because Commissioner King frequently reports on the state of implementation. That would leave us room for one more question. This is your chance. No? Yes, okay.
Henk Manakans, BT. I also understand from Commissioner King that, that we also may be looking for more instruments from also legal adaptations for giving law enforcement or authorities more, in a way, instruments to deal with cybersecurity and this kind of thing. So how does that relate to this debate? And also maybe related, like for example, we also see more and more questions about social media platforms